The envelope trembled slightly in Dr. Phil's hands as he stood center stage, his usual commanding presence replaced by something rarely seen: complete stillness. The studio had gone silent. No shuffling, no coughing, not even the sound of a camera moving. Two men sat across from each other in those familiar brown leather chairs, separated by mere feet but looking like they were oceans apart. One had his hands pressed together like a prayer. The other stared at the floor, jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscles working. And between them, Dr. Phil held a single sealed envelope that would change everything. "Stop the cameras," Dr. Phil said quietly. The entire production crew froze. In 20 years of taping, he'd never said those words before. But to understand why this moment shattered every protocol, why the audience would later say they witnessed something that felt almost sacred, we need to go back. Back to where this story really began. Back to two brothers who once shared everything, and then spent 43 years sharing nothing at all. Michael Torres was 61 years old when he walked onto the Dr. Phil stage. His younger brother, David, was 58. They looked alike in the way brothers do: same nose, same set of the shoulders, same unconscious gesture of rubbing their left temple when stressed. But they hadn't spoken since 1981. Hadn't been in the same room. Hadn't seen each other's faces except in old photographs that both kept hidden in drawers they rarely opened. The show had been billed as family feuds that destroyed lives. Standard stuff for daytime television. Dr. Phil's team had done dozens of these: siblings fighting over inheritance, parents estranged from children, cousins who stopped speaking over a Facebook post. The producers thought they knew what they were getting. They had no idea. Michael had been contacted first. A pre-interview, they called it. Just basic questions. Tell us about the estrangement. When did it start? Have you tried to reconcile? The standard intake process for the show. Michael's voice had been steady on the phone, clinical almost, as he explained that he and his brother hadn't communicated since their mother's funeral in 1981. "What happened at the funeral?" the producer had asked. "We buried more than our mother that day," Michael had said. Then he'd gone quiet for a long time. "I think we buried any chance of being brothers again." The producer had made notes, pressed for more details. But Michael had been vague, saying only that there'd been a misunderstanding, and words that couldn't be taken back. Classic family drama material. The kind of thing Dr. Phil could unpack in a 42-minute episode with commercial breaks. What nobody knew yet was that this wasn't about words at all. It was about a secret that had been kept for 43 years, a lie that had shaped two entire lives, and a truth that was sitting in a lawyer's office in Phoenix, Arizona, waiting to detonate. David's pre-interview had been different. He'd been angry, defensive. "Why would I want to see him?" he'd asked. He made his choice. He walked away. He doesn't get to just show up now and pretend like. His voice had broken. The producer had heard it clearly over the phone. The anger was there, yes, but underneath it was something else. Something that sounded a lot like grief. "Would you be willing to face him?" the producer had asked. "On the show?" The silence on the other end had lasted almost a minute. Then, "I've been facing him every day for 43 years. He just hasn't been there to see it." That's when the producer had known this was going to be bigger than a standard Family Feud episode. That's when she flagged it for Dr. Phil personally. That's when the real investigation had begun. Dr. Phil's team didn't just book guests and set up cameras. They dug. They researched. They called references, reviewed documents, sometimes hired private investigators. And when they started pulling at the threads of the Torres brothers' story, what they found wasn't a simple falling out. It was a tragedy that had been compounding for 4 decades. In 1981, Michael and David's mother, Elena Torres, had died of cancer at 53 years old. She'd been sick for 8 months. Michael, who was 18 at the time, had been away at college in Northern California. David, 15, had stayed home in San Diego with their father. In those final months, Elena had been in and out of consciousness, the medication making her confused, sometimes not recognizing her own family. At the funeral, something had happened. The exact details were murky. Different family members remembered it different ways, and most of them were dead now anyway. But the core of it was this: David had told Michael that their mother's last words had been about him. That in her final lucid moment, she'd asked for Michael, and he hadn't been there. That she'd died believing her oldest son had abandoned her. Michael had been gutted. He'd tried to explain. He'd been at school, he'd come home every weekend, he'd been there just 2 days before, she'd seemed stable. But David had been 15 and drowning in his own grief and anger, and he'd said things. Terrible things. Things about Michael always putting himself first, about him being selfish, about him caring more about his college life than his own mother. And Michael, 18 years old and shattered, had said things back. Had called David a liar. Had accused him of making it up. Had told him he was a stupid kid who didn't understand anything. They'd both been standing in the parking lot of the funeral home, still in their suits, and they'd screamed at each other until their father had physically separated them. They hadn't spoken since. Not at the reading of the will. Not at their father's funeral 12 years later. Not when Michael got married, or when David had his first child, or during any of the thousands of small moments when brothers might normally reach out. The wound had calcified into something harder than bone. But here's what neither of them knew, what the Dr. Phil team had discovered in their research, what was about to crack open on national television. Their mother's hospice nurse was still alive. She was 81 years old and living in a retirement community in Arizona. And when a producer had tracked her down and asked about Elena Torres's final days, she'd been very clear about something. Elena Torres's last words had not been about Michael. She'd been unconscious for her final 36 hours. She hadn't asked for anyone. She'd simply stopped breathing, peacefully, with David holding one hand and a nurse holding the other. So where had David's story come from? The nurse had a theory. She remembered a moment, maybe a day or two before Elena died, when Elena had been in and out of awareness. She remembered Elena saying something to David, something about Michael. But it hadn't been a dying wish or a condemnation. It had been something else. Something a 15-year-old boy in shock might have misheard, or misremembered, or twisted in his grief-stricken mind until it became something it never was. The nurse's testimony had been documented. Signed and notarized. It was sitting in that envelope in Dr. Phil's hands. The taping had started normally. Dr. Phil's audience had filed in, excited for their chance to see a live show. The warm-up comedian had done his routine. The producers had given their standard instructions: applaud here, stay quiet there, if you need to leave do it during commercial breaks. Michael had been brought out first. He'd walked onto the stage looking like a man heading to his own execution. Shoulders tight, face pale, hands shaking slightly as he sat down. Dr. Phil had been his usual self, direct but not unkind, asking the basic questions. How long has it been? What do you hope to accomplish here today? Are you prepared to face your brother? Michael's answers had been measured, careful. Yes, it had been 43 years. No, they'd had no contact at all. He hoped for, here his voice had cracked, he hoped for a chance to explain. To be heard. Maybe not forgiveness, but at least understanding. What do you want to say to him? Dr. Phil had asked. Michael had looked directly at the camera, knowing his brother was backstage watching on a monitor. I was there, he'd said. I was there as much as I could be. I loved her. I didn't abandon her. And I've spent 43 years wondering if she died thinking I didn't care. The audience had been very quiet. This wasn't the explosive drama they'd expected. This was grief, raw and old and deep. Then David had been brought out. The moment he walked onto the stage and saw Michael sitting there in the flesh for the first time in 4 decades, something in the studio shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was the opposite. It was like all the air had been sucked out of the room. David had stopped walking for just a second. Just a hitch in his step, barely noticeable. But Dr. Phil had noticed. The audience had noticed. And Michael had noticed, half rising from his chair before catching himself and sitting back down. They'd stared at each other. Two men in their late 50s and early 60s, carrying the faces of who they'd been at 18 and 15, but worn and weathered by all the years between. David's hair had gone gray at the temples. Michael had a scar above his left eyebrow that hadn't been there in 1981. They were strangers wearing the ghosts of brothers they used to know. Dr. Phil had let the silence sit for a moment. Then, "David, how does it feel to see your brother after all this time?" David had sat down slowly in the chair across from Michael. "I don't know," he'd said honestly. "I thought I'd be angry. I've been angry for 43 years. But right now I just feel..." He'd looked at Michael. Really looked at him. "Tired." "Tired of what?" "Of carrying this." Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The conversation had been civil at first. Almost formal. Dr. Phil had walked them through the timeline, the funeral, the fight. Both men had told their versions. Michael had explained about school, about the weekend visits, about being there 2 days before their mother died. David had described those final months, the fear, the responsibility of being the one at home while his older brother got to have a normal life at college. "I was 15, David had said. "I was watching her die. I was helping Dad change her sheets because she couldn't get out of bed. I was the one hearing her cry at night. And you were at frat parties." "I wasn't at frat parties," Michael had said, his voice tight. "I was at school trying to keep my scholarship because we needed the money. I was calling every night. I was coming home every chance I got. It wasn't enough." "I know." That had stopped David. His mouth had opened, then closed. "What?" "I know it wasn't enough," Michael had said. "I've known that for 43 years. I should have been there more. I should have dropped out of school. I should have been the one helping Dad. I should have been the one with her at the end." "You're right about all of that." Dr. Phil had leaned forward. "But that's not what the fight was about at the funeral, was it?" Both men had gone quiet. "David," Dr. Phil had said carefully, "tell me exactly what your mother said to you. Her exact words as you remember them." David had closed his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was that of a 15-year-old boy. "She said, 'Where's Michael? I need to talk to Michael.' She kept saying it. 'Where is he? I need to talk to him.' And then, he'd opened his eyes, looked right at his brother. She never woke up again. And I thought, I was so sure, that she died waiting for you. That her last conscious thought was wondering where you were." The audience had been silent. Michael had his hand over his mouth. Tears were running down his face. "And at the funeral," Dr. Phil had continued, "you told Michael this." "I was angry," David had said. "I was 15 years old and my mother was dead and my brother had been gone, and I wanted him to hurt the way I was hurting. So I told him. I told him she asked for him and he wasn't there. I told him." His voice had broken. "I told him it was his fault she was alone. But she wasn't alone," Michael had said hoarsely. "You were there. Dad was there. But you weren't. And I needed it to be someone's fault. So I made it yours." That's when Dr. Phil had stood up and walked off camera. The audience had stirred, confused. The producers had looked at each other. Dr. Phil had never done this before, never broken the flow of a show like this. He'd walked to his podium at the side of the stage, picked up an envelope, and stood there for a long moment, just holding it. Then he'd walked back to center stage and said, "Stop the cameras." The entire studio had gone still. Camera operators had frozen mid-movement. The producer in the booth had started to protest over the comm system but stopped when she saw Dr. Phil's face. This wasn't a bit. This wasn't planned. This was something else. Dr. Phil had stood between the two brothers, the envelope in his hands. "I need to tell you both something," he'd said quietly. "And I need you to hear it before we go any further." He'd opened the envelope. Read the hospice nurse's statement out loud. Every word. Elena Torres had been unconscious her final 36 hours. She hadn't asked for Michael. She hadn't asked for anyone. She'd simply slipped away, peacefully, with David holding her hand. David's face had crumpled. But I heard her. I swear I heard her say. You were 15. Dr. Phil had said gently. You were traumatized. Grief does things to memory. It wasn't your fault. And it wasn't Michael's fault either. The two brothers had looked at each other across that small space. 43 years of anger, guilt, and grief evaporating in the presence of simple truth. Michael had stood up first. David had stood up second. And then, without a word, they'd closed the distance between them. The embrace lasted almost a full minute. The audience was openly weeping. The camera operators were wiping their eyes. And Dr. Phil had stepped back, letting them have this moment, this reunion that had been stolen from them for 4 decades over a misunderstanding born from a boy's broken heart. When they'd finally pulled apart, both men were crying, laughing, holding each other's shoulders like they were afraid the other might disappear. I'm sorry, David had said. God, Michael, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry too. For all of it. For not being there enough. For the things I said. Dr. Phil had let them talk for a few more minutes. Then he'd addressed the camera directly. Sometimes the truth doesn't set you free right away. Sometimes it takes 43 years. But it's never too late. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After the camera stopped rolling, Dr. Phil had connected them with family therapists, given them resources for rebuilding their relationship. 6 months later, they'd sent him a photo. The two of them together at Michael's daughter's wedding. David had been the one to walk her down the aisle, standing in for the uncle who'd missed 18 years of her life. The envelope sat framed in Michael's home office now. Not as a reminder of pain, but as proof that some truths are worth waiting for. That some brothers are worth finding again. And that sometimes, healing begins the moment someone is brave enough to say, stop everything, and listen to this.